One cold night in late 1987, long after the last guest had left Garden Lodge and the laughter had faded from the rooms, Freddie Mercury stood alone in his kitchen, staring at a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. The house was quiet in that heavy way that only comes after too much noise. Earlier that evening, the music had been loud, the conversation wild, the cigarette smoke thick. Freddie had played his part flawlessly, the outrageous host, the wicked queen, the king of excess who made everyone feel like the party would never end. But now, everyone was gone. Everyone except him. And upstairs, in the bedroom they had slowly learned to share, was Jim Hutton, the Irish man with the gentle eyes and the quiet presence who had somehow become the single most stable thing in Freddie's increasingly chaotic life. Freddie knew something Jim didn't. A doctor in a private London clinic had told him days earlier what he had been secretly fearing for months: the blood tests were back. HIV positive. No cure. No clear timeline. Just a sentence dressed up in clinical language. He had gone home that day, walked through the iron gates of Garden Lodge, and told no one. Freddie Mercury, who could hold an entire stadium in the palm of his hand, suddenly couldn't find the words to tell the one man whose opinion mattered most. But denial has a short shelf life. That night in the kitchen, with the house finally still and the clock ticking too loudly, Freddie realized he couldn't pretend forever. Jim deserved to know. Jim deserved a choice. And Freddie, who had been abandoned, criticized, adored and used all his life, was terrified that once he spoke the truth, Jim would leave him like everyone else eventually did. What he said upstairs in that bedroom, sitting at the edge of the bed with his heart in his throat, would test their relationship in a way no public scandal ever could. What did Freddie tell Jim that night? How did Jim react when the man he loved told him he was going to die? And why, after hearing the worst, did Jim decide not to run, but to stay? Keep watching. Because this quiet, private conversation in a locked room reveals the side of Freddie Mercury almost no one saw, not the legend, not the frontman, but the frightened man who whispered, "I don't want you to see me die." And the lover who answered, "I'm not going anywhere." The clinic had been too bright. Too white, too clinical, too full of quiet desperation. Freddie had hated it the moment he walked in, the antiseptic smell, the discreet, too polite staff, the way the other men in the waiting room avoided each other's eyes as if fear were contagious. He had worn sunglasses and a scarf and told himself it was just to avoid recognition. Deep down, he knew it was to avoid mirrors. When the doctor came in with the folder, Freddie knew before a single word was spoken. He watched the doctor's face as he opened the file, that tiny softening around the eyes, the careful modulation of the voice. He had seen people look at him like that before. Not as a star. As a patient. "Mr. Mercury," the doctor began, "the tests have confirmed." The words that followed were a blur of syllables Freddie had already read in newspapers and magazines about other people. HIV. Positive. Prognosis. Unknown timeline. Complications. Management. Monitoring. Freddie listened with a strange kind of detachment, like he was watching someone else's interview on television. He cracked a joke midway through, just to see if he still could. "Well, doctor," he said lightly, "this is all very grim and tragic, but tell me, will I still be able to sing in F sharp?" The doctor blinked, caught off guard. I don't see why not, Mr. Mercury." "Good," Freddie replied. "It's the only thing I'm any good at." He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. On the drive home, London felt different. The traffic was the same, the grey sky the same, the impatient honking the same. But everything seemed slightly distant, like he was watching it through a pane of thick glass. The world moved on as usual, completely unfazed by the fact that his life had just split into before and after. Inside the car, the silence pressed against his eardrums. His assistant tried to make conversation. Freddie shut it down with a wave of his hand. "Not now, dear," he said. "My mind is full." The gates of Garden Lodge opened with their usual heavy creak. The brick walls, the high windows, the hidden garden, all of it looked exactly as it had that morning. But stepping through felt like crossing into a different life. He walked inside, dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by habit, hung up his coat, and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. Music from a radio somewhere. Distant laughter from one of the staff. Footsteps upstairs. Jim. Freddie's stomach twisted. He could hear muffled singing from the top floor, Jim humming along to some song on the radio, probably in the bathroom shaving or folding laundry with the easy domesticity that had once scared Freddie and now soothed him. It hit him then, with the force of something physical. He wasn't alone in this. He had made a life with someone. Not just lovers, not just fun, but a life, shared mornings, shared routines, shared keys, shared bed. And now he was returning to that shared life carrying something invisible and deadly. He could have gone straight upstairs. Instead, he walked past the staircase and went to the piano room. He sat down heavily on the bench, lifted the fallboard, and placed his fingers on the keys. He didn't play. He just stared at his hands. They looked the same. Everything looked the same. He pressed a random chord, listened to it echo in the room, then fade. He thought about every article he'd read, every headline, every whispered story about that disease ripping through the gay community. Faces of friends who didn't come to parties anymore. Names mentioned less and less. Someone saying, "Did you hear about?" He had always filed those stories in a mental folder labeled "Out There." Now, that folder had been moved inside of him. The housekeeper peeked in. "Would you like some tea, Mr. Freddie?" He almost said yes. Instead, he shook his head. "Whiskey," he murmured. "The good one." She nodded and slipped away. Freddie leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles paled. He had faced scandal before. Accusations. Trials. Headlines. He knew how to handle public drama, with denial, arrogance, humor, or sheer force of personality. But this? There was no judge to convince. No reporter to charm. No crowd to seduce. Just a virus, quietly rewriting his future. Upstairs, he could hear Jim moving around. The sound of a drawer closing. A door creaking. The simple, ordinary sounds of domestic life. For the first time since the doctor's words, Freddie felt something pierce through the numbness. Fear. Not for himself. For him. For the man upstairs who had moved into his life with such patience and gentleness. For the man who had seen past the glitter and the legend and had chosen to stay anyway. How do you tell someone that the future you've been building together just shrank? He didn't have an answer. So he did the one thing he'd always done when cornered by life. He postponed the truth. He told no one that day. He poured the whiskey. He played the host. He cracked the jokes. And when Jim leaned against the doorframe that night and asked, "You all right, love?" Freddie smiled and said, "Never been better." The lie lodged in his throat like a stone. It wouldn't stay there forever. One night, it would have to come out. And when it did, nothing in Garden Lodge would ever be the same again. Garden Lodge had always been Freddie's fortress. Tall brick walls, heavy iron gates, thick curtains, secret gardens, a sanctuary for a man who spent most of his life in front of millions. Inside those walls, he could breathe differently. He could be messy, soft, human. He could shed the persona that the world mistook for the whole of him. But on that night, as he walked through the quiet house with the doctor's words rattling in his skull, even Garden Lodge felt unsafe. The walls seemed too close. The air felt too still. Every room echoed with a truth he was trying desperately to outrun. He wandered the halls with no destination, one hand trailing along the wallpaper as if touching the house might anchor him. It didn't. Every light he turned on made the shadows feel deeper. Every mirror he passed felt like an accusation. At the far end of the hall, he stopped in front of a framed photograph, a candid shot of him and Jim taken in the garden the previous summer. Freddie was laughing, head thrown back, hair blowing in the wind, while Jim stood behind him with an arm wrapped protectively around his waist. Freddie lifted the photo off the wall. Held it closer. His breath caught. He remembered that day clearly. Jim had taken the picture without warning. Freddie had been teasing him, calling him a clumsy Irish oaf for tripping over a flower pot. Jim had responded by grabbing him from behind and spinning him, both of them landing in a heap on the grass, laughing so hard that Mary watched from the window and yelled, "You two are going to crush my roses." The memory stung. That version of Freddie, the carefree one, the one who laughed with his whole body, suddenly felt like someone from another lifetime. Someone he might not get to be again. He set the photograph down on the hallway table just as he heard footsteps behind him. "Thought I'd lost you," Jim said gently. Freddie didn't jump. Jim had that kind of presence. Quiet. Steady. Like someone approaching a frightened animal without wanting to scare it away. He turned slowly. And for a moment, he forgot how to act. Jim was standing barefoot, wearing a soft cotton t-shirt and pajama bottoms, hair damp from a shower. His eyes, blue and warm, searched Freddie's face with that intuitive awareness that had always unnerved him a little. "You okay?" Jim asked. Freddie's first instinct was to lie. It was muscle memory at this point. "Of course, dear," he said, too quickly. "Just wandering about. Can't sleep." Jim didn't look convinced. He stepped closer, lifting a hand to brush a stray strand of hair off Freddie's forehead. "You look tired," he murmured. "And not your usual, I've been drinking with the band, tired. Something else." Freddie swallowed. "I'm fine," he said again, softer this time. "Really?" Jim tilted his head, studying him. He had a way of observing Freddie that made him feel transparent. Seen. Freddie hated it and needed it in equal measure. "You sure?" Jim asked. Freddie's heart twisted. No. No, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Instead of answering, he reached for Jim's wrist and squeezed it lightly, a silent plea, "Not now." "Not yet." Jim nodded, sensing the boundary. "Come upstairs," he said gently. "It's freezing down here." Freddie followed him up the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top, Jim paused and turned back. "You know," he said softly, "you don't have to pretend with me." Freddie froze. For a split second, the words cracked him open. He wanted to say everything. Right there on the landing. He wanted to collapse into Jim's arms and sob until his lungs hurt, tell him about the clinic, the test, the doctor's expression, the coldness of the word positive, the fear of being a burden, the terror of dying slowly, the shame of having to confess it, the dread of seeing pity in Jim's eyes. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he forced a smile, the stage smile, the one he used when the mask needed to stay on. "You're sweet," he said. "Terribly naive, but sweet." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Naive? I've lived with you for years. You think anything surprises me anymore?" Freddie almost laughed. Almost. They entered the bedroom. Jim went to close the curtains. Freddie stood in the doorway, staring at the bed, their bed, suddenly struck by how fragile the moment felt. How fragile he felt. Jim turned back and noticed the way Freddie was holding himself, arms crossed loosely, shoulders tight. "Love," he said, stepping closer. "Something's bothering you." Freddie felt the truth rising like a tide he couldn't stop. "Jim," he began. His voice cracked on the name. Jim's expression softened instantly. "What is it?" he asked. "Tell me." Freddie opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I can't tonight," he whispered. "Not yet." Jim nodded slowly. But then he stepped forward and took Freddie's face in both hands, gently, lovingly, firmly enough to ground him. "When you're ready," Jim said, "I'll be here. You don't have to rush it. You don't have to be brave for me. You don't have to be anything for me except yourself." Freddie blinked rapidly, fighting tears. He wasn't ready yet. But the moment was getting closer. The lie inside him was getting heavier. And when it finally came out, it would break something, or save something. He lay beside Jim that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of Jim's breathing. He knew tomorrow wouldn't be like today. He knew the truth was coming. And he knew that once he said the words, "Jim, I'm sick," nothing about their lives would ever be the same again. The next morning arrived slowly, dragging a pale, gray light through the curtains of Garden Lodge. Freddie had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the clinic. The doctor. The file. The word. HIV. It echoed in his skull like a bell struck too hard. Jim woke first, stretching quietly beside him before leaning over to kiss Freddie's shoulder. It was a familiar gesture, gentle, domestic, grounding. Normally it made Freddie smile. But today, it made him flinch. Just a small movement. Barely noticeable. But Jim noticed everything. He sat up, studying Freddie's back. "You're worse this morning," Jim murmured. Freddie remained still, staring at the window. "I'm just tired," he said. "Not that kind of tired." Freddie swallowed. There it was again, the terrifying accuracy of someone who knew him too well. It stripped away his defenses until he felt naked beneath it. Jim placed a hand on Freddie's arm. "Talk to me," he whispered. Freddie closed his eyes. He couldn't. Not yet. The words still felt too poisonous to release into the room. Instead, he stood abruptly and walked to the wardrobe. Jim sighed softly. He didn't push. He never pushed. Freddie dressed in silence, slacks, sweater, rings, the armor of routine. His reflection in the mirror looked almost normal. Almost. He noticed the way his collarbones jutted a little sharper than before. The slight hollow beneath his eyes. The faint tremble in his hand when he adjusted his hair. He clenched his jaw. He couldn't hide it forever. Downstairs, the house was waking up. Someone was boiling water. Someone else was dusting the corridor. He heard Mary Austin arrive, her key turning in the front lock, her familiar footsteps echoing with purpose. Mary and Jim exchanged greetings as Freddie descended the stairs. Mary's eyes narrowed immediately. "What's wrong with you?" she asked bluntly. Freddie forced a grin. "Good morning to you too, darling. You look radiant in your I smell trouble face." Mary raised an eyebrow. "I've known you since you were a skinny teenager pretending to be a rock star. I can tell when you're lying." Jim, standing behind Freddie, crossed his arms. Freddie waved them both off and retreated into the kitchen. He needed noise. Movement. Distraction. He opened cupboards, closed them, rearranged a bowl, wiped a counter that didn't need wiping. His hands were shaking. He hoped neither of them noticed. They noticed. Mary stepped into the doorway first, arms folded. Jim stood behind her, leaning on the doorframe, watching Freddie like someone waiting for a bomb to go off. "Freddie," Mary said firmly, "what happened at the clinic?" The bowl slipped from Freddie's hand and hit the counter with a dull thud. He froze. Jim straightened. "What clinic?" Mary shot Freddie a sharp look. "He didn't tell you." Freddie's heart slammed against his ribs. Mary's intuition had always been too good. Too sharp. She could read him the way others read sheet music, easily, naturally, painfully. Jim's eyes darkened. "Freddie, what clinic?" Freddie inhaled sharply. This was it. The moment he had tried to outrun was now standing in front of him, Mary on one side, Jim on the other, both waiting, both bracing for something they didn't yet understand. His throat tightened. His palms went cold. His vision blurred. "Both of you sit," he said quietly. Mary sat immediately. Jim did too, though his posture was tense, protective, worried. Freddie didn't sit. He couldn't. He stood by the counter, gripping the edge with white knuckles, as if the solid wood could keep him upright. "I didn't want to burden anyone," he began, voice thin. Mary's eyes softened. Jim leaned forward. Freddie swallowed hard. "I didn't want to say it until I knew for certain," he continued. "And now I do." Silence fell like a curtain. He closed his eyes. And finally, "I'm sick." Jim blinked. "What do you mean, sick?" Mary didn't look away from Freddie's face. He forced himself to speak the rest. "I tested positive." Jim's breath caught. Freddie's voice cracked. "HIV." The kitchen, normally warm, cluttered, alive, felt suddenly airless. Jim stared at him as though trying to force the words to rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Mary covered her mouth, her eyes filling instantly. Freddie felt himself shrinking under the weight of the truth he had unleashed. "I found out a few days ago," he said, voice trembling. "I went alone. I wanted to protect everyone. I thought maybe it wasn't true. Maybe it was some terrible mistake." A bitter laugh escaped him. "It wasn't." Jim stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He moved toward Freddie, but Freddie flinched and stepped back, holding up a hand. "No," he choked. "Don't. Please. Just, don't." Jim froze. Tears pooled in Freddie's eyes. "I don't want you to see me like this," he whispered. "I don't want you to stay only to watch me disappear. You didn't sign up for this." Jim took a slow step forward. "Freddie," he said gently, voice breaking, "I love you." Freddie shook his head violently. "No. No, you can't. Not now. You don't understand. This thing will kill me. It will take everything, my voice, my strength, my face, my dignity. I don't want you here for that. I don't want you to watch me die." Mary stood and placed a hand on Jim's arm, steadying him, grounding him, as Jim's eyes filled with pain. Jim looked at Freddie the way people rarely had in his life, not as an icon, not as a performer, but as a man terrified of being loved too deeply. "If you think," Jim whispered, "that I'm going to walk away from you now, after everything we've already been through." He shook his head. "You don't know me at all." Freddie pressed a trembling hand over his mouth, barely holding himself together. Mary stepped beside him, placing her hand gently on his back. The truth was out. The lie was dead. The room was broken open. And so was he. For a long moment, no one moved. The word HIV still hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. The kitchen, normally a place of warmth and noise and clattering dishes, had turned into a confessional, small, harshly lit, unforgiving. Freddie stood with his back pressed against the counter, chest heaving, eyes wet. Jim and Mary faced him like two different embodiments of his past and present. Mary, the anchor who had known him before the world did; Jim, the man who had walked in late but stayed for the hardest parts. "You should go," Freddie said finally, his voice ragged. The sentence seemed to confuse the air itself. Mary frowned. "What?" Jim blinked slowly, as if he'd misheard. "What did you say?" Freddie swallowed, looking at Jim but not quite meeting his eyes. "You should go," he repeated. "You both should. Before this becomes something you can't forget." Mary stepped forward. "Don't be ridiculous." Jim's jaw clenched. "You think I'm going to walk out because you're sick?" "This isn't a cold," Freddie snapped, the fear in his voice sharpening into anger. "This isn't a week in bed with soup and sympathy. This is—" He stopped himself, hand flying to his mouth, as if the rest of the sentence were too ugly to release. Jim's voice softened. "This is you. Still you." Freddie laughed bitterly. "For now," he said. "But not for long. You've seen what this does to people, Jim. You've heard the stories. Wasted bodies. Hospital beds. People who used to be beautiful, vibrant, full of life, reduced to someone you only recognize by their eyes." He looked at his own hands, fingers trembling. "I won't do that to you," he whispered. "I won't make you watch me come apart." Mary's heart twisted at the words. She stepped closer, her tone firm. "Freddie, you don't get to decide for us what we can or can't handle." He turned on her, eyes flashing. "Yes, I do. It's my mess. My body. My exit. If I can't control the disease, I'll control the damage." Jim shook his head slowly, eyes shining with something deeper than hurt, a kind of wounded astonishment. "Damage," he repeated. "Is that what you think loving you is going to do to me? Damage me?" Freddie opened his mouth, then faltered. Jim stepped toward him, voice low and intense. "Let me make one thing very clear," he said. "I didn't fall in love with the man on stage. I didn't fall in love with the posters or the records or the goddamn crown they put on your head when the lights are on." He placed a hand flat on his own chest. "I fell in love with the man who makes tea in the middle of the night because he can't sleep. The man who feeds stray cats through the garden gate. The man who hums melodies under his breath when he thinks no one can hear. The man who panics when someone he loves is hurting and hides it behind a stupid joke." His voice shook now. "If that man is sick, then I stay. That's how this works. That's what love is. Freddie's lips trembled. Don't romanticize this, he whispered. There is nothing beautiful about dying. Jim took another step closer. They were barely a meter apart now. There is something beautiful about not letting someone die alone, he said. The sentence sliced through the tension. Mary felt tears sting her eyes. She placed a hand on the table to steady herself, watching the two men in front of her, one trying to push love away as a form of protection, the other refusing to be moved. Freddie shook his head, desperate. You don't understand what you're signing up for, he said. The hospital visits. The weight loss. The infections. The way people will look at you. The gossip. The fear. They already talk, Jim. About me, about us, about this house. You'll be dragged into it. Branded. Marked. Jim shrugged, a small, almost defiant gesture. Let them talk, he replied. They always did. You think I started getting stared at only when I met you? He took a breath. I'm not afraid of them, Freddie. I'm afraid of waking up one day knowing I walked away when you needed me most. The kitchen went quiet again. Mary stepped around the table and came to stand beside Freddie, close enough that their shoulders brushed. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was solidarity. It was history. You remember when you told me the truth about who you really were? Mary asked softly. Back in the 70s? Freddie glanced at her, the memory passing like a cloud over his face. I thought I would lose you then, he said. You didn't, she replied. You never did. I stayed. Just in a different way. She looked at Jim. And so will he. Freddie looked between them, the woman who had once worn his ring and the man who now shared his bed. For a moment, he felt dizzy, like he was standing at the intersection of his own timelines. What if I don't want you to see me like that? He asked, voice cracking. What if I want you to remember me, as I am now? Loud. Ridiculous. Still halfway pretty under all this makeup. Jim gave a broken laugh through his tears. You really think I'm in this because of how pretty you are? He asked. You daft man. He closed the final distance between them and, slowly, deliberately, reached for Freddie's hand. Freddie flinched on instinct, a flash of fear crossing his face. Jim didn't let go. Listen to me, Jim said. I know what this means. I know what could happen. I know how this story goes for a lot of people. But you are not just a lot of people to me. You're the person I chose. And I'm not unchoosing you because things got ugly. He squeezed Freddie's hand, grounding him. You want to push the rest of the world away? Fine. Shut the gate. Draw the curtains. Tell the press to go to hell. I'll help you. I'll build the wall with you. His voice softened. But don't shut me out. Don't decide for me that I can't love you through this. Freddie stared at their joined hands. His shoulders began to shake. A sound escaped him, half sob, half laugh. You'll resent me, he whispered. One day, when you're spoon-feeding me or arguing with doctors or sleeping in chairs by a hospital bed, you'll look at me and think, I should have left when I had the chance. Jim shook his head. If I leave now, he said quietly, I'll resent myself far more than I could ever resent you. Mary placed her hand over both of theirs. Let us stay, she said simply. Let the people who love you. Completely. Not just during the parties. During this too. Freddie's walls, carefully built over years of fame and wounds and survival, finally buckled. The first sob tore out of him, raw and helpless. His knees gave way, and Jim caught him, pulling him into his chest. Freddie clung to him like a man drowning, pressing his face into Jim's shoulder, crying in great, shuddering gasps that shook his whole body. Mary stood close, one hand on his back, tears streaming down her own face. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them, in a sunlit kitchen that had become a sanctuary and a battlefield all at once. Outside, London went about its business. Inside Garden Lodge, something sacred had just happened. Freddie Mercury had finally said, "I'm sick." And the people who loved him most had answered, not with fear or distance, but with the quiet, terrifying bravery of choosing to stay. Morning light crept slowly into Garden Lodge the next day, slipping between the curtains like a quiet intruder, uncertain if it was welcome after the night that had passed. The house felt different, not broken, not healed, but suspended. As if it were holding its breath, waiting to see what the truth would do to the people living inside it. Freddie woke with swollen eyes and a heaviness behind them, the kind that comes from crying until the body runs out of strength. Jim was still beside him, half sitting, half lying, having stayed awake for most of the night with an arm around Freddie's shoulders as the sobs eventually softened into exhaustion. For a moment, Freddie didn't move. He simply stared at the ceiling, listening to Jim's breathing, feeling a strange mixture of dread and safety. He had expected Jim to disappear sometime during the night, to slip out, pack a bag, leave through the garden gate while the house was asleep. But he hadn't. He was still here. That realization made Freddie's chest tighten in a way that hurt but also softened him. Jim stirred, eyes opening, voice rough with fatigue. "You're awake." "Unfortunately," Freddie muttered. Jim gave a small smile. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been run over by a lorry," Freddie replied, rubbing his temples. "Twice." Jim didn't laugh. He only brushed a hand over Freddie's hair, the gesture so tender that Freddie had to look away. Downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes and voices signaled that Mary was still in the house. She'd refused to go home the night before despite Freddie insisting she didn't need to stay. She had set up camp in the guest room, claiming she didn't trust him not to do something foolish, which Freddie had indignantly denied. He wasn't going to do something foolish. He was just trying to figure out how to live in a body that suddenly felt like a countdown. Jim stretched, wincing. "We should go downstairs." Freddie grunted. "Do we have to?" "Yes," Jim said gently. "We're not hiding from her. Or from this." Freddie sighed dramatically. "Fine. But no one, and I mean no one, is allowed to look at me with pity. I'll throw them out myself." "Noted," Jim said. "No pity." He paused. "But love isn't pity, Freddie. Don't confuse the two." Freddie didn't respond. He wasn't ready to accept love yet, not fully. Love meant letting people stay. And staying meant watching. And watching meant hurting. He wasn't convinced anyone should sign up for that. But they already had. When they arrived in the kitchen, Mary was sitting at the table with a mug of tea, looking like she hadn't slept either. She glanced up as they entered, not with pity, but with a quiet, steady affection. "Morning," she said. Freddie groaned. "I despise mornings. They come far too early." Mary raised an eyebrow. "You slept until 11. 11 is still morning," he argued, slumping into a chair. Jim set a cup of tea in front of him. Freddie stared at it as if it were a foreign object. Mary cleared her throat. "We need to talk about things." Freddie tensed immediately. "No. Absolutely not. I refuse to talk about anything serious until I've had at least 7 more hours of denial." Mary ignored him. "You need a doctor, a good one. Someone who knows what they're doing." Freddie bristled. "I already have a doctor." Mary frowned. That clinic doctor doesn't count. You need someone experienced. Someone who can monitor you properly. Jim nodded. She's right. Freddie glared at both of them. Oh, wonderful. A mutiny. It's not a mutiny, Mary said. It's help. Freddie looked down at his hands. Help. He wasn't sure he knew how to accept it. He'd spent decades being the strong one, the one with the answers, the one who could charm or shout or sing his way out of anything. Accepting help felt like surrender. And surrender felt like death. I don't want to be treated like a patient, he said quietly. Jim reached over and placed a hand over his. Then we won't treat you like a patient, he said. We'll treat you like Freddie. Mary nodded. Exactly. No fussing. No smothering. Just, supporting. Freddie's throat tightened. Support sounded dangerously close to love. He took a shaky breath. Fine, he said. We'll find someone. But on my terms. Mary exchanged a look with Jim, the kind of look people share when they're relieved but trying not to show it too obviously. Freddie rolled his eyes. Oh, for God's sake. Stop looking at each other like I've just agreed to climb Everest barefoot. Then, quieter, I'm not that fragile. Jim squeezed his hand. We know. Mary stood and began rummaging through the cupboard. Good. Now eat something. Freddie stared at her. I have just confessed to being terminal, and your response is to feed me like an elderly aunt. Mary shot him a glare. Freddie Mercury, if you think I'm letting you waste away before my eyes, you are out of your dramatic little mind. Jim chuckled under his breath. Freddie scowled at both of them. But when Mary placed a plate of toast in front of him, he didn't push it away. He picked up a piece. Took a small bite. And felt something shift inside him. The doctor's words were still there. The fear was still there. The uncertainty was still there. But now. So were they. Mary pouring tea like nothing had changed. Jim sitting beside him, refusing to move an inch away. The house settling around them, no longer suspended, but adjusting, bending, not breaking. For the first time since the diagnosis, Freddie didn't feel like he was falling alone. He took another bite of toast. Well, he muttered, if you two insist on turning this into a funeral rehearsal, at least give me something more interesting than toast. Jim smirked. Toast is a start. Mary sat back down. One day at a time, Freddie. Just one. Freddie exhaled slowly. One day at a time. He could do that. Maybe. As long as they were here. Night settled over Garden Lodge with a heaviness that felt almost sacred, as if the world itself were aware that something delicate had shifted inside those brick walls. The day had been long, emotionally brutal, and strangely comforting all at once. Freddie felt wrung out, emptied, scraped raw, and yet, held. Jim had spent most of the afternoon quietly reorganizing things around the house, not overprotective, not hovering, but present in a way that anchored Freddie without suffocating him. Mary had stayed too, sitting with him in the living room while he pretended to read a magazine he never turned a page in. And now, as midnight approached, the house had gone quiet again. Freddie stood alone in the garden doorway, staring out at the faint silhouettes of the trees. The night air carried a chill, gentle but insistent, brushing against his arms like a reminder of the body he now feared. He wrapped his robe tighter around himself. He heard footsteps behind him, slow, hesitant. Jim. Didn't think you'd be out here, Jim said softly, stepping beside him. Freddie didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the garden lights glowing dimly among the hedges. "It's quiet out here," Freddie murmured. "Quiet is easier today." Jim nodded. "You've had a big day." Freddie gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's one way to put it." A long silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighty. Jim waited, sensing Freddie was still piecing himself together inside. "Are you angry with me?" Freddie finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jim blinked. "Angry? Why would I be angry?" "For not telling you sooner. For making you find out like that. For being such a bloody coward." Jim frowned. "Freddie, you're not a coward." Freddie shook his head. "I am. You think I hid it because I wanted to protect you? That's a lovely idea, but it's not the truth." He swallowed, throat tight. "I hid it because I couldn't face watching your expression change. Couldn't bear the idea of being pitted. Or worse, watched like a tragedy that hasn't finished unfolding." Jim's voice softened. "Is that really what you think I'd do?" "Yes," Freddie whispered. "Not because you're cruel. Because you're human. No one is built to love someone through this." Jim took a slow, steady breath. Then he surprised Freddie by stepping in front of him, blocking his view of the garden. Gently, he placed both hands on Freddie's arms. "Look at me." Freddie hesitated, then lifted his eyes. Jim's gaze held no fear. No pity. Only something deeper, something almost unbearably tender. "I can't promise you I won't be scared," Jim said. "I can't promise it won't be hard. But I can promise you this." He tightened his grip slightly, grounding, not controlling. "I'm not going anywhere." Freddie's chest constricted. "You should." "I won't." "You might regret that." "I won't." Freddie blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. "What if I fall apart, Jim? What if I'm not me anymore?" Jim shook his head. "You think I only love the parts of you that perform? The parts the world worships? I fell in love with the man who sings off-key in the bathroom when he's brushing his teeth. The man who steals bites of my toast when he thinks I'm not looking. The man who cries at old black and white films and pretends he's allergic to dust." Freddie let out a wet laugh, tears spilling. "I do not cry at films." Jim smiled softly. "You cry at everything. And I love you anyway." Freddie covered his face with one hand, shoulders shaking. Jim pulled him into a slow, deliberate embrace, the kind that felt more like a promise than a gesture. Freddie clung to him, pressing his forehead against Jim's shoulder. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I know," Jim murmured. "I am too. I don't want to die." "I know." Freddie's breath hitched, the raw honesty of the moment tearing through the last of his defenses. Jim cupped the back of his head. "We take this one day at a time. Together." Freddie shook against him. "It will get ugly. Then I'll love you through ugly. It will hurt. Then I'll be your calm. It might break you." Jim's voice dropped, steady and unshakable. "Loving you is not what breaks me. Losing you is." Freddie looked up at him, eyes shimmering. "You really mean it, don't you?" "I do," Jim said. "I'm here. For all of it." Freddie let out a long, trembling breath, as if finally releasing the last piece of fear that had been choking him since the diagnosis. He rested his head against Jim's chest again. "You're a fool," he whispered. Jim smiled into his hair. "Maybe. But I'm your fool." A soft wind rustled the garden leaves, carrying the faint scent of the night-blooming flowers Freddie loved. The world outside kept turning, distant traffic, a faraway dog barking, someone laughing on a street corner. But inside Garden Lodge, everything had changed. Not because of the diagnosis, that had been inevitable, but because of the vow that followed it. Freddie pulled back slightly, looking into Jim's eyes. "If you stay," he said quietly, "I'll try to let you. Even when it gets hard." Jim stroked his cheek. "That's all I need." Freddie exhaled shakily, then nodded. They stood together at the garden doorway, letting the night wrap around them like a cloak, neither speaking, neither moving away. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't hope in the traditional sense. But it was something Freddie hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety. Not certainty. Something deeper. He wasn't alone. And for a man who had spent a lifetime performing so the world would love him, the quiet, steady love of one person felt like the bravest thing he had ever allowed himself to accept.